So let's start from the beginning. Evolution
Yes.
of the productivity space. What do you think is coming next? That's the topic of our discussion today.
I'm going to give a little bit of background. So I
Yeah.
think it was the Elite Digitalist or something like that on Twitter. I can't remember. I apologize. I probably should have got the site before we started recording. But essentially, they tweeted and someone responded, and then they responded, and I got tagged at some point in this thread. And the beginning was about how productivity has evolved over the last sort of like 20, 30-ish years, saying that the focus was on task management, then time management, then energy management. And at the moment, it seems to be life operating systems, so creating a system for yourself in whatever app, tool, thing that you have. And the question was, what's next? Like, what's the next big focused thing? And there were a few different answers.
Mm.
I asked John, we got talking, and we thought, hey, let's just start recording.
Yeah. I think what I'd like to see is more, and I hate the phrase, but it's the easiest description, is like more invisible systems that just, there's still a lot, especially in the space that we inhabit, or in and like a lot of like, I need to do something to make this work. It requires a lot of effort and work and action, whereas what I think I'd like to happen is more dynamic systems, as we were talking about before, where the systems kind of evolve around the human and the individual and or the company, like the individuality of the company, versus what it's still very much like you've got to fit yourself into the system rather than the self being part of the system. That's the evolutionary track that I would like to see. That's what I want to see, and would be more valuable for people, because then it can take all of the previous evolutions and create something that genuinely is helpful for the people using it, instead of what we have now in the productivity space of a very much repairing, trying to fix, rather than a what is actually true for the individual.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, AI is obviously going to be part of this conversation. It can't really not be because of the evolution of AI, but how AI is implemented in productivity, I think, is a more interesting question, because it's easy to say tech and AI because that's just evolving. But how is it going to be implemented? I think is where the conversation should be moving towards with regards to productivity. And I was saying this before we started recording. I think science, just generally cognitive psychology, cognitive science in general, I think is going to start finding its way into more concrete elements of productivity. So at the moment, you see active recall, which I think is a completely pointless term. I'm not going to talk about that, but you have elements of retrieval practice and encoding and what the brain sort of does. Like, well, we remember stuff in long-term and short-term memory stores, maybe. And that's part of the study conversation, but not quite productivity. And I think there is elements of it starting to move into productivity, especially with regards to, this may be triggering to some people, but especially with regards to the neurotypical conversation about working memory. Working memory and the science of all of that is starting to become a conversation in how much attention you can pay, how much you can do at work or can't do at work, and then how you build environments to help you out, whoever you happen to be. But that environment conversation obviously involves science, well, should involve science. And I think that is where the conversation in my mind will start moving towards. What science they use, don't know.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing, because we started talking of like, we both, I think, agree of like, we want it to go the ecological dynamics route, because that's the one that makes more flipping sense. And like, just hearing you talk about that, it's like, once we start going in the direction where cognitive science comes right out into what we're doing, and like the information processing kind of way of thinking, which is what you were talking about, I think people are going to start to find problems with that. And in the productivity space, we're problem solvers. We like to solve problems and figure new things out. And I think that could be an entry point for conversations around ecological dynamics, perception and action affordances, all of the lovely stuff that what I found is, as I've done more research, thank you, Illicit, as I've done more research, I'm like, well, yeah, this is my experience. Like, what I see here is my experience. I just never had the words to describe it before. And so having like a science basis or science theory basis is actually really helpful.
Evidence-backed is...
Thank you. Evidence-backed. Thank you. That having that evidence-backed, like, this is how I work, is super valuable. And I think as people move into where we were a little while back, of like from that information processing, or where I was a little while back, and then you see the issues with that, you're like, yeah, but I don't store, and that doesn't make, and that depends on what environment I'm in. When I'm inside with the kids, I don't have any of the stores that I have when I'm in here working, and it changes and it's different. When I'm out, I'm doing like all of the different pieces and issues that come are going to become more prevalent in the productivity space. And that is going to be quite interesting.
From my perspective, looking at what I see at the moment in the space of these sort of conversations, is they have something they want to do. They have actions and actual protocols, to use a scientific term. They have protocols of things that they're going to do to help their issues, their problems. They have a solution, but the solution and the actions that they do don't match the science that they're trying to justify it with. It's kind of saying, yes, I'm going to make this dish with foods that don't go in the dish. And you're like, what? That doesn't make any sense. Which is why when I see these explanations, I'm like, no, no, that's not quite right. And I think for maybe a little bit of relatability for some people, there is a model in memory, which a lot of people know, stimulus, processing, action, just a general thing. You see something, you process that information, whatever that means, and then it goes into memory, right? It's the multi-store memory model. Basically, you see something, you process it, it goes into memory. But when you perceive something from the environment, you use long-term memory, because if you see something a second time, you've used your experiences, prior knowledge, or something like that. So it can't be linear, because if it was, long-term memory would be at the beginning. But it can't be at the beginning if we go through a process and then it's at the end, which means it's got to be a circle. There's got to be a circle in there somewhere. It does get much more complicated because you have Bayesian brain hypothesis and loads of other things that I've actually explained in the video I'm working on. So fingers crossed that one goes well. But if you take that assumption that we have long-term memory at the start as well, well, now learning isn't a case of, oh, we need to find the best solution, the best idea thing, put it into long-term memory, store it, and then push a button and go, yes, I'm going to activate this thing from long-term memory now. Well, that can't happen if we use long-term memory in perceiving the environment we're in. Like you were saying, I'm in my workspace now. I'm using my long-term memory, whatever that happens to be, and process information and bring all of those things to the forefront. Well, you can't be at the end if you're at the start. Like, it's not a linear process.
And then you have the risk when something is spherical or circular and a loop, you can get stuck in said loop and there is no action. Exactly. There is no motion and movement. And in certain areas of the productivity space, that is a big issue, especially in the Notion playing things, or especially in the Notion space, as all the way back, I don't even remember what it was with Layla, of like, she went, Notion people aren't productive, they just like to play, or something along those lines of like, we just want to feel productive. And then there is that loop that we get stuck in. And I think that's where so that I've been trying to do with my work is figure out how to, well, couple it, which is exactly what it is. It's coupling. It is literally 1, 2, and the friction in between, like that couplet generates that action and moves things forward, rather than it being a spherical thing, which information processing kind of lends itself to. Because if you bring, or am I still going a bit too beyond information processing, would you say?
You've made some assumptions in there that unless people understand the difference between direct and indirect perception,
That's true.
they would be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Indirect information processing doesn't lend itself very well to circular motions. Because it tries to make things linear because of indirect perception. We don't have enough information in the environment. So the circles they make are in what's called predictive processing. So we predict what's going to happen moving forwards. And that's their idea. Inside of ecological dynamics, and just in general in our conversation, we have an environment, and like you were saying, perception and action are coupled. So when Notion does an update, if you take an IP approach, your perception, your new stimulus, your new environment now needs updating, because you need more predictions and more things to get your mental model accurate. Inside ecological dynamics, it doesn't matter, because you're not adjusting to the environment. You're just adapting your solutions with the environment. Very small distinctive differences,
but it has quite a big impact. That it's such a, it's so nuanced. Like the differences are nuanced in many ways, but also like such a big change and a big shift.
Yeah, I mean, with the example we're speaking about now, Notion changes something, IP approach, I need to now adapt my systems so it's the best, or so it suits my working model, so my predictions, my future predictions, my processing is accurate. From ED, well, it doesn't matter that it's updated it, because if my environment still has the solutions that work for me, I don't need to change anything, because the solutions, i.e. the affordances, still function, and the constraint of the new thing, whatever the update was, hasn't impacted my solutions. So you don't need to change anything. They're two drastically different results from the same stimulus.
Yeah. It's super fascinating.
And that right there is a conversation that I think inside of science has happened. Like there are discussions and arguments all over the place, especially in coaching science, because this is where it's prevalent, because ecological dynamics traditionally, as you probably found out, is basically skill acquisition. That's the only place I can seem to find it.
That literally is all I can find. Which is great, but also sucks, because as soon as you start like productivity, business, I mean, systems theory is they are kind of interlinked quite a bit from my experience, but it's not, the connections haven't been made and haven't been really bought into the business world for me and in the productivity, and it's like, oh my gosh, this unlocks a heck of a lot. And it's like, I cannot wait for everyone to catch up and to come in, but it's not something that you can explain in a 5-minute YouTube video.
My video is 25 minutes, I think, which isn't bad considering.
That's not bad.
I mean, I've gone through memory models. I've gone through predictive processing. I've gone through information processing. That's like the first 10 minutes. Then I went through systems theory. Then I went through direct perception. And then I compared prospective and prospective control through indirect and direct perception, and then applied that into my practice and how I remember what I learned, like towards the end. So I've covered a fair chunk of stuff, and there are a lot of big words in there that I've tried to express and cover, but there are so many pieces of prior knowledge that people just won't grasp or won't understand. So it's more of an introduction than a, hey, this is the thing.
I can resonate with that, as I've been reading the papers and just going through and because I took the reflections from Illicit, and then I'm like, okay, I want I want a bit more. One thing I'm finding with it is that it has the answer to my question, and that's about it, which is fine because that's exactly what it's supposed to do.
Yeah.
But I want more. Give me more. So that's when I'm starting to dive into the papers as well and doing the highlighting and all of the magical stuff. And yeah, go buy his thing because it is working really well.
So there is an interaction inside of ecological dynamics that I won't get into too much, but it's something that I've been thinking about quite heavily, because one of the biggest issues at the moment in ecological dynamics, like in the discussion, is people from information processing, the majority of the population. I say population because it's just the world. When we're speaking to someone, we say, oh yeah, I remembered that, or I couldn't remember that. Like, it's a store. The implicit instruction is, I forgot it because it fell out of my memory, which is information processing. And that memory idea is very hard to change because it's just ingrained in society. It's ingrained in the environment that we live in as language and communication. And there's an interaction inside of ecological dynamics, which is where offline information in the environment comes online inside of a different environment within the original environment, and the systems that are inside the environment, again, systems theory, and that interaction, offline to online, is where extended cognition, embodied cognition, those sorts of theories get involved inside of ecological dynamics. And again, that's ecological dynamics, which is systems theory, direct perception, and extended cognition. They are three very nuanced theories all together. So you're like, how do you get this forwards? And the only way you can challenge what memory is if people already understand what memory is, but that's currently not quite in the productivity space or in the public eye. So it's like, before we can introduce this thing, they need to understand why it's different from what they already know. Misconceptions, conceptual change, that sort of stuff. So it's like, it's almost like we're a step ahead, kind of, in that, like, we need you to understand what you think you understand already, so we can then pull it apart.
Yeah, I'm wondering, like, I think for some people they're already there, but they don't know they're there. Like,
exactly.
They know, because that happened for me. It's like, as soon as you started talking about it, I was like, this makes perfect sense. This is just like, duh. But also, I didn't know that either. It was like, yes, that is my experience. That is my lived experience that I have. It makes sense.
This is something else that I bring up in the video that I think is interesting, which is, I think, also interesting about the tweet. In information processing, traditionally, the idea is knowledge of, like, not knowledge of the thing. So all of your expertise is in your head. Like, I know how to do this thing. I can explain how to do this thing because I understand it. And that means I can do it. But it doesn't. Like, we arbitrarily will say, just because you know the theory doesn't mean you know the practice. But when you look at people practicing, they try and practice in a medium that they can understand and explain. But that's a different medium to actually doing the thing, doing the skill. Inside of ecological dynamics, it's knowledge in. So you don't necessarily know how to explain it because it's a different medium, but the expertise is in the interaction, perception and action, between the environment and the person. So you can do something and be really good at it, but have no idea how to explain it because it's a different medium of communication of the action, right? And that is where I think you were at. You knew how to do things because you could do it, but you didn't know how to explain it. And when you tried to explain it, you're like, I don't know. So people could say you don't have expertise because you don't have knowledge of the thing, but you do have expertise. It's in the action. Now I think you've got a bit more of an understanding about how to explain it because you have a different set of skills.
Yeah, and the skills have developed through being in it. And also, like, I suppose it would be like switching the environment, which is looking into ecological dynamics. I'm now in a different environment, which allows me to have that, like, development of skills, learning how to explain what I do when I'm in the other environment. Would you say?
I wouldn't say the environment's different. I would say the environment has changed because inside of the environment you were in, you have self-organized information, parts and elements in the environment into your own system. So you've brought things into your system from the sporadic environment, which is us talking. You've brought that in, you've organized it yourself and gone, yeah, that is this thing. And then you can explain everything else in your system because you have brought something in, which is called autopoiesis. It's great fun.
Yeah. I like that. Autopoiesis.
Don't try and spell that word. It's horrible. But essentially the system constantly updates itself. I think it's from chemical biology. Nicholas Luhmann brought that term, exposed the term to me. But yeah, so you're constantly evolving and updating your system to avoid entropy, which is where the system just becomes extremely chaotic and just goes back into the environment it was in. So you have, under autopoiesis, you've organized your system using information from the environment, which is our conversations. And now you can express that self-organization because you have attuned your skill to that
changing environment. Yeah.
You now have a medium at which you can explain the organization, which that's how I would explain it from an IP perspective. You now have a memory store of it. You have a schema of it.
Yeah.
Okay, if you say so.
Yeah, when you say I have a schema, yeah, memory. Now, every time I hear that, I'm just like, it is so. I remember, you said it before. Once you, it's the red pill, blue pill thing. Once you swallow that pill of ecological dynamics, when you look at the other one, you're like, oh no, no, even more no. As I come back in, I think I'm reaching that point where you were right at the beginning. You're just like, no, it doesn't. No, just no. This whole thing is a no.
I'm not poo-pooing information processing because we don't actually know, for fact, which way works or which way doesn't. They're two explanations for the same thing. But one paradigm of thought, i.e. type of explanation, information processing, has so many bugbears in there for me that we don't have any answers for. And it's almost impossible to find the answers for them. That I'm bashing my head against the wall. It makes no sense that I can't find a rational, logical link between what I see happening in the world in practice and what you're trying to explain. It seems like you're going 100 steps up a hill in the wrong direction to get to the top. You're like, I don't get it. Why are you going that way?
Yeah.
Maybe it comes around the other side and comes back up. Who knows? We're not there yet. But you can't. I heard this on a conversation. I can't remember who it was. It was probably Rob Gray, not going to lie. But he was saying in the information processing approach, you have this processing thing, and it's like a black box. They talk about it, but they don't really know what's in it. We process stuff. We do predictive processing, but what does that mean? What's in it?
What does it actually mean? Yeah.
It's similar with attention. I know executive functions, we have these things to help focus our attention, but what is attention? Is it just looking at something? I can look at something and not pay attention to it. So what is attention? It's just this black box. It's executive function. That's what it is. Yeah, but what is it? What does that mean? Tell me something. And I feel like they explain trends of behavior rather than really giving us something we can use, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I I found that. So while I was doing a little bit on attention and focus and flow and some of the research of how it works and the neuroscience of how the pieces of the brain works and the sense systems and all of the wonderful funky systems that our brains use, it was okay, that's great, but you still haven't answered the question. You just said, this is how it works. Okay, good, great, cheers. What now?
Yes, it's this is the brain area that's activated when you do this thing. And so what? Yes, I know my brain is active when I'm thinking. what do I do with that? How do I use that information? How is that
Yeah.
useful? And
Yeah.
and then they go and give you something that you can explain very simply through ecological dynamics. You're like, yeah, well, obviously, because in your environment, you don't have the information, or the information is too much to organize or attune. There's an example in the video that I put out, Ronaldo heading a football from across, but it goes dark. So basically, in football, someone has crossed the football to Ronaldo, and some novice, Ronaldo can head the ball or tap the ball in with his foot or with his shoulder, and the lights go completely dark. As soon as the person kicks the ball, goes dark, he can't see anything. So no more new information. There's two ways to explain it. One's he's predicting the ball, he's doing math in his head. The other one is, well, he just looked at the way the person kicked the ball and then knew where the ball was going because of the information. The novice learner, when they looked at the person kicking the ball, they didn't have an attuned sense of what information to look for. They were looking at the ball, they were looking around, and like, I don't know. And then the ball pitch goes dark, and the player's like, well, I don't know where it's going, and just have to guess. It's not because they don't have experience of the ball being crossed in. They probably have played football before, but they don't have an attuned understanding of the skill that was being presented, i.e. crossing the football. And there are two different ways of explaining that thing, like attunement. You're like, oh, okay, so if someone's attuned to the environment, attention, cool. Rather than, well, you activate this part of your brain and blah, 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 blah. You've lost me.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what happens in the productivity space is everyone's trying to explain the calculations.
Yep.
Of like, when you look at all the Notion systems, the really beautifully complicated, deliciously nerdy systems that exist, it's all about explaining the calculations. But no one has the same, I don't believe everyone has the same calculations. They don't. Everyone's calculations are different. And that, I think, is where the issues of this space are. The big problem is everyone is trying to share their calculations and expect everyone to follow those calculations, when really everyone has individual calculations, and some pieces of that calculation may align with what you have, but you're not, it's not the same. And that, I think, is where my brain's like, yeah, that is what I'd like to see, is less about the calculations and more about, and what my role is and what I want to do is let's talk about the calculations and more talk about, well, from my understanding, attunement of your own calculations, and actually like getting more focused in on what you have already.
Yeah. Organization.
Self-organization. Yeah.
Yeah. It's self-organization of the information available, which is the attunement of a skill. You're looking at loads of information. What do I actually need to pay attention to? I now have expertise because of whatever practice you put in. So now when you have that environment, the online information, you can attune your focus to what you actually need to know, rather than just, oh, there's loads of stuff going on. So yeah. Yeah, and when you said working through calculations, it made me like think of the model that I shared a second ago, like stimulus, process, act. Like that, the process bit is what everyone's so focused on. This is my process. But that process is different to everyone because, like I said, everyone has different prior knowledge. And prior knowledge is long-term memory, which is obviously the end bit, and the beginning and the middle. So...
Sorry, I'm having this experience now. So I wrote out the best possible version explaining how I do my work from a marketing perspective. It's very valuable. And oh my God, this is so hard because there's so much nuance that is just gone due to the medium, due to the environment that I'm in. There is so much nuance that now is lacking, and trying to portray that nuance in a clear way is where I'm at right now. And I'm like, okay, here is sort of what it is, but also there is way more here that you can't see.
I got to a point trying to do this video that I'm editing at the moment, where I went to my sister and I was like, don't take offense to this, but I need a dumb person. She was like, what? I was like, I need someone that is hypocognitive of ecological dynamics. So she came in and I basically explained, okay, how do you see this? And we went through cognitive psychology and ecological dynamics and the differences. And I needed to get someone that hadn't taken the pill, that didn't really grasp ecological dynamics, to explain cognitive psychology to me in a way that made sense. Because every time I tried, I was like, there's no logic in that. And I was like, but there's no logic in that. And that's not what we know that's not the, and I just got frustrated. I couldn't find a way to explain something because there were too many holes in it. It was literally like trying to catch water in a colander. The water was just falling out. I'm like, I'm getting nowhere with this. So I was like, I need a dumb person. Yeah, it was just, obviously you can phrase that any way you want. That's why I used hypocognitive of ecological dynamics, because it's a more academic way of saying dumb person. Okay.
I love that.
I mean, that's what Dunning and Kruger obviously researched. They research hypocognition and hypercognition inside the meta-ignorance, and that's the video that I'm going to do after the one that I'm editing right now. But yeah, and I mentioned the word in a previous video as well, hypocognitive. But we're all hypocognitive of something, and we have far more ignorance of things that we actually know about, and that's the boundary. That, yeah, once you're cognitive or cognizant of something, it's very hard to not be, which is the idea of the beginner's mind.
Yeah.
So where do you think AI comes in to this conversation? Obviously, we've spoken about sciencey stuff that we're interested in, the audience maybe not. Where do you think AI comes in? Obviously, we spoke about illicit last week. Was it last week or maybe the week before? And obviously,
hang on. It was our last week. It was last week for them because the episode was going out. Yeah, who knows?
Cool.
The illicit episode, whatever.
Yeah, and obviously that uses AI. How do you see AI inside of productivity moving forwards? Obviously, Francesco, for whatever reason, seems to have a love relationship with Mem at the moment. Did you see his tweet? He was saying that Mem is the new Evernote.
Oh, I did see that tweet.
Yeah, and I was like, no. No, I don't like that.
The problem is we're all still focused on features.
Mm-hmm.
And until we stop focusing on features, I don't think AI is going to be valuable. Or I think it will have limitations. Because people will try to build their systems around AI. I think the benefit of AI will come in once again, completely biased, but aren't we all? Like, once we understand how we work, then the use of AI becomes a support tool rather than the integral, like the subject at the, what's going to happen, what I predict is going to happen is AI is going to become at the center of everyone's productivity system. And it is still not going to work. It's still not going to work. And then eventually people will do what they've always had to do, start with them and put them at the center of their system. And I think AI has the potential to support that, but I have my doubts. I find it will lower the constraints, because for me, I found illicit reduce the constraints of me actually doing research again, and it unlocked the ability to just go, hey, it's the getting started piece for me that is the most difficult. It's like, I need to find these papers, I need to grab figure out whether it's something that I actually want to read and whether it's relevant to me and blah, 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 blah. I think it will be a good jumping off point. That is how I think AI should be used. I believe that's the best, most effective way of using AI as a jumping off point. But I think what's going to happen is it's going to be the center. It's going to be like, I'm going to build my systems around AI, and AI is going to make me do things. It's kind of like what automation is right now. Of like, I'm going to automate everything and all of this stuff. And because if I automate things, then I don't have to do things and blah, 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 blah. I think that's what's going to happen with AI first. And then it's going to become like a jumping off point and a starting point that people can develop their own way and just understand how they work.
Yep, I agree. I think AI is, like you said, it reduces constraints. I think it simplifies some tasks. It does complicate other tasks, but I think it's a nice, what I would call a coaching aid, a coaching tool. I mean, I'm going to replace coach with educator eventually in my vocabulary, because coach, teacher, educator, they're all essentially the same thing. Yes, there are professional differences, but when we're talking about the science, I don't think the professional differences really make a difference. So I think it's an education tool to simplify a lot of tasks. But like you're saying, I think, again, it's going to come down to the paradigm or the way people are thinking about the task itself, i.e., I'm doing this task this way because of these things, the best approach, the whatever solution, blah, 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 information processing, or, oh, I'm going to create an environment for me to learn X, Y, Z, or do A, B, C, etc. So like you say, I think it's an element. I can't think of another word. It's just another element to bring into the environment that people need to organize themselves. I think ecological dynamics, I think they need to organize that element themselves in ways that help them with the different systems they have in their life and their work. And you said something that I guess I want to poke a little bit. You said build a system. Now I know you think that we already have systems. So I know you were speaking from another person's perspective, like I need to build my system.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, when you said build system, are you assuming that person doesn't think they have a system and they need to build one?
I think a more accurate would be build upon the system. It's like adding new pieces. Or it's kind of come from two spaces. It's like one space is like building a system. They don't have a system, or they don't know their system is the more accurate thing, but they see it as don't have a system.
Yeah.
And so that's where I'm building that one from. But also it's like build upon, as they have to add more pieces to the system, and AI will build upon their system. Those are the two kind of, I shortcut the sentence. Thank you for getting me to expand it. Of like, it is building upon and also building a. So it's kind of both from a perspective of like, I don't have a system that works, or my system isn't enough.
Okay.
And
yeah,
it needs more.
That's how I thought you were. This is going to get really meta. That's how I thought you were thinking about how they thought about it. And the way that I would look at that is they haven't attuned their focus to the system that they already have.
Yes.
So I guess what you're doing, this is just me spurting whatever comes out. I guess what you're doing is you're trying to bring awareness. You're attuning their focus to the system they have.
Yeah, that's literally what I do. That's quite literally what, if I was to put it in a delicious sentence like that, I'm just attuning them to the systems that they have. Like, their focus to what they already have, and then building upon that. What happens in the space that I inhabit for business owners is specifically, they're like, I need the apps and the features to make my system. And the apps and the features are what is the system. That is the system, rather than what they already have. I've had conversations with clients of like, oh, I'm not using it the way you built it. I'm like, good. That means you've done what I wanted. Like, I don't want you just to use the system I built for you. I want you to develop it and build up and build upon and actually use it in a way that fits you, because you've seen what has been created and you're like, oh no, I like it like this.
So from a you coaching business perspective, if people are coming back and saying, I'm not using it the way that you meant it for, is that an assumption they have made from what you've said?
Yeah.
I'm just thinking, because maybe there is a way that you are expressing what you're trying to put across. So you're creating an environment where that's the affordance they are perceiving. They're perceiving the affordance of, I need to use this thing and I need to abide by the constraints that John uses, rather than here is a thing, here is something you can use, play an experiment sort of thing. I don't know how you communicate it, but
yeah, so they were a very early client,
right,
as well. That was the example I was using, was an early client. But yeah, since then it's quite hard to express that. That is something that I'm trying to develop, is how to express, like, hey, this is something to play in. This is not the end. And that is something that I'm like having these conversations and trying to express that in a way that makes sense to, is it hypocognitive?
they don't know. Yeah, they don't know how to articulate or put a word to what they're experiencing.
Yeah.
So something that comes to mind inside of the coaching literature, the sports coaching literature, there is an approach called the constraints-led approach to coaching. Which you may be familiar with, and the constraints-led approach uses ecological dynamics as a fundamental framework. And inside of coaching, you then create an environment, and as the educator, you would then add or remove constraints and affordances to move people towards a more effective solution to them that they have done themselves. They've created the solutions themselves through self-organization. Now, I have never seen constraints-led approach be used in any other context, because sports coaching is just, that's where it is. But maybe, I have no idea how you would do it, but maybe try and leverage the constraints-led approach inside of business coaching and see what and how that works.
Super interesting. And I think when we were having the conversation a couple of weeks back, one of the episodes we were talking about, I think I sort of did that with the workshop I ran. Around the constraint was, we're building a resource thing, but really what I actually wanted you to figure out was what I know now, is like the attunement of your systems, what your self-organization, what you already have. So that, I think, is that I've jotted it down to go and dive into some more like research on that and what that looks like, because that is super fascinating and actually would be really,
it's one of those things that sort of, once you've taken the pill and you go, how do I get other people to do this thing without, like, how do you get someone to see constraints and affordances that you can see because you have organized the environment? How do you get someone that hasn't organized that to see that, but not by telling them what it is, because now you're giving instruction and they're not going to figure it out and they're not going to self-organize. So it's like, how do I get someone else to self-organize things that I've already done? You need to merge or mold or shape the environment that people are learning in through practice principles, etc., etc. And that is where the coaching science is. The coaching science is trying to develop those environments, but because ecological dynamics is in sport, I can't find anywhere else that does it. So I'm kind of like, I'm doing it for myself in my own like notes and working online and learning online. I have to create my own environments because I've got no one else to create the environments for me. But I recognize, because I'm meta ignorant of things I don't know, I'm creating environments that are inherently biased. So it's like, I need to talk with people that know differently to me to try and avoid meta ignorance, etc., which is the whole idea of don't be the smartest person in the room and that sort of thing. That's how you'd approach that from an ecological perspective. So the constraints is useful, but it's like, the old adage in science, we need more research.
yeah, absolutely. That idea of, my brain's like, ooh, a constraints-led approach to like business coaching, because often it's very much it also lends itself more to one, there are constraints. So one, it's actually a little bit easier to market because you are from where I'm at and what my understanding is through no research whatsoever, but just having constraints in itself is valuable from a point of explaining what the bloody hell's going on. Because without it, it's just too much.
So there are always constraints and affordances in the environment because of direct perception, but by adding constraints in from an educator into an environment, you simplify tasks. And task simplification a lot of the time brings clarity for the person trying to organize things, because instead of having thousands of things in the environment going like, what the hell's going on, the constraints decrease the amount of noise in the environment, which is task simplification, not modularity, which is information processing. That's like, oh, we're going to take you out of this, put you over here where there's like no chaos. You're going to figure it out over there. And then you're going to put it all the way back in. Like, what? How does that work?
No. It is genuinely like, yeah, that's weird.
That's what they do. And that, when you think about it, how people teach and coach traditionally in sport and most of the time in school, they simplify a task by taking it out of the environment. You're going to learn to do this thing all the way over here in this really small box, which it could be like football. We're going to pass backwards and forwards between each other, between these cones in a line. That modularity. Now we're going to put you in a football game. Now you can pass. Well, I'm not passing forwards now. I'm passing diagonally. Like they're not the same thing. You attune your skill to a different environment. Then you suddenly put the skill in the original environment. It's a different thing. So you still have the same problem. But yeah, that's another one of those features, I guess you could say, of the differences between IP and ED. And it's yeah, I'm biased, very biased.
Yeah, unfortunately, so am I.
We need someone from an IP perspective to come in, but I feel like that this is, you may have seen this in the video that you saw with Rob Gray, towards the end where he compares IP and ED. He's like, it's funny how the movement of people go from IP to ED. It doesn't tend to go from ED to IP.
Way. Yeah, I know.
It's like people adopt ED from IP. They're like, yeah, I can't really explain this thing, and I'm in the IP camp. But ED explain it pretty well, so I'm going to use that. But I'm not going to go over there because I don't believe in all of it. And you're like, oh, okay, fine. And then eventually they end up moving that way. You're like, what? I don't see people, maybe it's because of the lack of exposure to ED, but I don't see people that have gone to ED go back to IP. It's kind of like where I'm at the moment. I look back at IP and go, I mean, I guess you explained it like that, because I can't, at the moment, ED research is like less than IP. I'm like, okay, you explained it like that, but now you've got this problem, and this limitation. So I'm going to try and explain it in a different way, but use you as like a model to go, yeah, that's not right, I don't think.
Yeah.
Rather than just believing IP, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's moving from just questioning what is and like accepting. Yeah, that was the
verbs and nouns as what's his name? I should know his name. Andrew Wilson. Andrew Wilson did a blog post about verbs and nouns. IP, look at verbs like things, like memory is stored, whereas ecological dynamics is actions. You remember. Like instead of this is a store of something, verb, I'm remembering process how to do the thing. So information processing typically looks at verbs like things that places have stored, like this is a store, this is a thing, this is a thing, whereas nouns are this is this process, this is this process, this is this process, sort of thing. It's an interesting blog post. But yeah, all over the place today. I mean, we spoke about ecological dynamics, but that's kind of expected at the moment. But yeah, AI in productivity, I think is a useful element moving forwards. But how people use it is going to depend on their perspective of like using stuff, if that makes sense. I don't think it's going to help a lot of people. I think it's going to complicate the environment more for a lot. Yeah.
And for those, I think what it will do for those who already are self-organized, it's going to be really useful. And really, I think it's going to be most valuable to those who are already self-organized and are just adding in this new piece to play with, new element into their environment. And I think that is where the value is going to come. But if you're going in blind and you don't know what you want, you're just going to, it's just basically one more feature. It's one more thing that you're adding in for the sake of adding it in. And then it's one more complication that you've added that's going to make things harder for you and more unhelpful.
Yep. I think that's a nice place to close it out.
Yes.
Right. Well, thanks for listening, everyone. And you can hear us next week. I was going to say we'll see you next week, but we don't see you. John, no. I will see you next week.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Oh, there we go. We could do like a Vlog Brothers thing, you know, where like Hank and John, they do go backwards and forwards. Like, John, I'll see you next week. Hank, I'll see you next week. So I think, yeah, John, I'll see you next week. Because I will.
That's great.
Like they talk to each other in the vlogs rather than the audience, but they do talk to the audience during it, if that makes sense. So yeah, John, I'll see you next week.
See you next week.